Okay, I am Janessa Durrani. I am the Executive Director of IFMA Boston. Welcome to today's virtual roundtable so that we can continue this conversation. We have noted that there is no shortage of topics as it relates to COVID-19, beginning, middle, hopefully an end, post, and so forth. So thank you for joining the conversation. We're going to just dive right into some breakouts. So I'm going to drop you into breakouts for about 5 minutes. And the question that we would like you to answer, so when you come into your groups, you will talk amongst yourselves as far as this topic. And then if someone could be elected your scribe, so when you come back out of the room, if you could leave your answer in the chat, that just helps us kind of navigate the right topics that we're talking about for the rest of the question and answer. And when we get to question and answers, you're welcome to do it in the chat and I will be feeding those to Jack as we go, or you can unmute yourself and actually ask. We're a smaller group today, so it should not be unruly. So, and feel free to share your own experiences with everyone. So, the question, have you developed a startup plan to return back to work? And if so, have you started to integrate that plan with HR and other business strategies groups within your company? And then probably, how's that going? So I'm going to, break you into 4 groups, okay? Does everyone know the question? Startup plan integration. There you go. All right, have fun. Okay, welcome back. It's Friday. So I'm going to now officially introduce our moderator for today's discussion. And again, if one person from each of the breakouts could just give some feedback as to what the consensus was, as how everyone's doing, we will use that later in the discussion. So today we have Jack McCarthy, Sc.D, C.I.H, President of Environmental Health and Engineering, EH&E, a private multidisciplinary engineering and management consulting firm based in Newton. Dr. McCarthy specializes in research and communication of environmental risk and developing creative solutions to complex, multifactorial environmental and occupational issues. Jack's teams are known for being innovators in identifying meaningful and quantifiable environmental project goals and implementing evidence-based designs for their achievement. He's been the principal investigator for federal studies under the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and has or is currently consulting with the U.S. Surgeon General's Office, USEPA, NIOSH, the Centers for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, and the U.S. Department of State. So welcome.
Yes.
So you go ahead, and so Jack has a presentation, so he's going to present some thoughts for us and some learning pieces, and then, as I said, as we go, just feel free to ask any questions in chat, and when we get to the end of the presentation, feel free. So again, as I was noting before, now if you see at the top there's a bar, there is a view options, and you can pick side-by-side mode if you would like. And then you can put speaker view, and then that just puts Jack and the presentation up. Go for it, Jack.
Okay, thank you, Janessa. Well, hello, everybody. And, you know, I appreciate you all making the effort to be here on the Friday afternoon before Memorial Day. And even though we may be staying at home a lot, I know you all have a lot to get ready for. But as we're going forward, it's interesting to see the different steps that are being taken right now by different states, and we're working in multiple states, and so we're seeing some dramatically different programs being implemented and startup times occurring. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the key motivation that we're seeing right now occurring, and what's driving that. And hopefully that'll give us a chance to stimulate a little discussion among the group and see what your experience is. And I just want to get into a little bit of the background of what we're seeing before we talk about some very specific tasks that are worthwhile to undertake. And we see again the preparedness of different teams is varying dramatically. And a lot of it has to do with the organizational structure they may be in, and if they find themselves in different silos. So I think that this is a really good opportunity for us to talk about this. And this is really a very timely discussion as we all start to get our buildings up and operating again. So I'm trying to advance my slides here, and give me a moment. Something up here. Okay. So as Janessa said, we've been in environmental health and engineering has been around for over 30 years, and we feel very strongly about our mission of integrating engineering services along with a strong environmental and occupational health program, so that we really can look at buildings in a very comprehensive way. And and what we've done is really focused in on having our teams work together very closely with multiple disciplines, both within our company as well as with other people and our clients that we're working with. And that has actually proven to be very successful because we're able to help facilitate some discussion and get to resolutions quicker than we ordinarily would get to if we were doing it in a more siloed manner. The other thing that's critical for us is ensuring that we have verifiable performance, and so that we can look at benchmarks, but more importantly, we can really understand how your buildings were intended to operate and be sure that we're developing ways that are consistent with the long-term safe and economical operation of those buildings. So some of the different elements that we've worked with, we've done this for a long time. We started out, not started out, but one of the major programs we undertook for the Transportation Research Board was to look at infectious disease mitigation in airports and on aircraft. And a lot of the recommendations that we made are now being implemented in airports across the country, as well as on aircraft. And so it's interesting in that, and a little disappointing in a way, that a lot of the recommendations that were put forward several years ago aren't being implemented until we have a major pandemic on our hands that is really a worldwide issue. But it is happening now, and I think we'll see improvements. We also are currently doing a project for the American Camp Association and the National YMCA to develop programs. We're doing this in conjunction with the Centers for Disease Control to bring children back into daycare centers and camping systems, both day camps as well as nighttime. And then finally, myself and two of my colleagues, John Spengler from the Harvard School of Public Health and Jonathan Samet from Johns Hopkins, wrote the Indoor Air Quality Handbook and edited that book, which is covers the broad aspects of the indoor environment and health impacts. So one of the things that we've seen as the coronavirus has created a fear of buildings and offices. So we're all familiar with FOMO, which is fear of missing out. Well, now we have FOBO. And there was a large survey that was done by a social networking firm, and they looked at 6,000 employees. They asked 6,000 employees that whether or not they were hesitant to go back to work because of the coronavirus outbreak. And interestingly enough, the results show that 70% of the people that they surveyed, and these are all high-tech engineers that were involved in this survey, were somewhat or very afraid to go back to the office. And the primary reason for this was because of the fear of the unknown and fear of becoming ill. So a lot of the steps we're going to be talking about, although they may seem basic at first, are going to be important to develop into a layering program. And then the ability to communicate that to people as to their effectiveness and the safety net that's being created for them is going to be critical in getting our offices back to where we want them to be. So one of the other things that we see, which is tragically occurring, that there's a lot of pandemic-related liability. And there's been a whole lot of discussion about, how can we limit that? We don't see Congress taking any major steps right now that would create some limits on liability. So right now, it's a bit of the Wild West out there. So I bring this up because it's critically important to have your risk management team and your legal group intimately involved in any plan that you start to bring into play right now, because it's going to be critically important that they're supporting it, they understand it, and they're going to feel comfortable in using that going forward, because ultimately it's going to be a number of lawsuits that may come out of this. So we talk about workers' compensation as being a stopgap. Right now, we're seeing that even employees are working on ways, and employee liability attorneys are looking for ways to get around the workers' compensation bar that is set up, so that they can, in fact, sue on some general duty issues and the like. So what we feel is important right now is that as you start setting your building performance criteria and taking steps to implement these, that it has to be clear and it has to really meet the current standard of care to effectively manage risk. And being able to go back and refer back to the standards that are put forward by the Centers for Disease Control, by the World Health Organization, by various groups such as, industry groups such as ASHRAE and the AIHA, American Industrial Hygiene Association, is going to be really important in being able to put an effective barrier between legal liability issues and the operation of the buildings and bringing people back in. And so, again, something that unfortunately we do have to take very seriously and we do have to pay attention to. So the other thing that we're finding with a lot of groups right now as they're starting to come back in to the workplace is that there's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. And people have heard things, and some of it was actually developed in good faith, people trying to get answers to different questions that occurred that were coming up very early on as the pandemic was starting to spread. But unfortunately, they have taken on their own mythology and are still being repeated over and over again. And a lot of that has to do with how long viruses will survive on surfaces, the types of cleaning that has to be done, transmissibility. And we're also seeing that a lot of vendors, if you will, are now starting to promote different services and different technologies that are may be effective against coronavirus, but may not be and may not be necessary. And so being able to understand where the limitations exist on the technologies, but more importantly, being able to understand how the coronavirus is actually transmitted and transferred will help people make better decisions as to the technologies that they want to put in place and how they're going to utilize the limited resources that we all have to deal with. And so this is, again, to make informed decisions, using our resources wisely, and then being able to take that information to then validate the decisions that have been taken and utilize that in discussions with leadership and the community in general. So one of the things I'd like to take, this is someone coughing. This is a high-speed camera shot, photograph of someone who is coughing. I have one that's equally disgusting for someone who is sneezing. And, but I think the important thing here is looking at, first of all, the size of the droplets that are being expelled. They're quite large. They're hundreds of microns in diameter. There's also a very large distribution of very fine droplets that are being expelled at the same time. And this is where a lot of the 6-foot distancing comes into play, because what has been shown is that because of the size of the droplets, as well as what's known as the cloud effect, where you're really expelling a large volume of particles that are essentially forming a cloud, they'll settle out pretty quickly. And most of these, you'll find a very large proportion of these will settle out in the first 3 to 4 feet. 6 feet, you'll lose up to 85, 90% of them. And then going beyond the 6-foot mark or 6.5-foot mark, you'll be seeing a very, very low percentage of particles. And that's important. And so being able to utilize the social distancing that we've taken on with respect to the 6-foot mark is actually pretty effective in helping minimize direct contact with droplets that may be released. The other thing to bear in mind is that there's what we call the aerobiological pathway. What that means is what are the different steps that have to occur when you have a source, which are the humans, that will be expelling materials either through discussion, talking, I should say, coughing, sneezing, singing, that type of where you're actually expelling a lot of air. But we also can be shedding them in general, just in general discussion. So, it's important that we understand the source of this and how we can control it. That's why we can take some interim steps, such as using cloth masks or disposable surgical masks to help limit the transmission from the source. But then the different steps that we have include the release. And so again, taking some other measures that we can use in a localized manner to better control things is important. How is it transported? And it can either be expelled, as we're seeing this release right now, or it can be moved on air currents as well, whether it be direct airflow or just general air movement. So we want to understand the importance of that. Then thinking that is then going to tie into the dispersion of how that can occur. Ultimately, that's going to then translate into deposition. And ideally, what we want to be able to do is to minimize deposition directly on other individuals, because that's the major route of infection that's occurring right now, or onto surfaces, because if you have a high enough infective dose that occurs on a surface, then coming in contact and then touching your face, whether it be your mouth, nose, eyes, can then increase the chance of infectivity. And that's really what we need to do. So the key thing that we need to be thinking about in our buildings is how do we separate what we have in yellow at the top is the source, and then the ultimate impact, which is infection in yellow at the bottom. If we can disrupt any one of those steps in the middle, we will virtually eliminate infection in our buildings. So there are different ways you can look at it. The National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health have developed what they call a hierarchy of hazard control. And with that, these are the different steps where we look at elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and personal protective equipment that can be utilized in order to minimize hazards. And we think about that and try to think of the best way of doing it, of course, is to eliminate the potential hazard. Unfortunately, the only way that we're going to eliminate COVID-19 is if we can get a large enough population that has immunity. And so right now, as we look at this, you need about 60% of your population has to be immune, so they have to develop immunity for COVID-19 to be considered under control. And that's what is typically called herd immunity. Now, there's two ways of achieving this. One is with the vaccine, and we all know, and we've heard, even though the desire is to get the vaccine out into the marketplace very, very quickly, it is going to be somewhere between 12, 18, 24 months. The other thing we have is exposure, where people become ill and then recover. And so as you think about exposure, you want to be sure that you're minimizing vulnerable populations. And we'll talk a little bit about this as we go forward. But the important thing here is, in the meantime, while we're waiting to be able to develop a herd immunity within our population, what other steps can we take? And so one of the things we've done, which is to think about substitution, is that we start modifying our lifestyle. And so here we're using masks that are going to limit the release of material into the general areas that we're talking. We're looking at social distancing that will help dramatically. And then we've also moved people out of our buildings, and we've moved them into other settings, primarily their homes. And these all work very, very effectively. However, it also tends to start to compromise different elements of the work environment that we have and the interaction that we feel is so critically important. And so, getting people back into play here is going to be important. And so we need to move beyond some of these substitution methodologies that we have and start thinking about controls. So they are really going to be the key thing for us right now, whether they be engineering controls or administrative controls, or in reality, a combination of the two. So this gives you a general idea as to what we're looking to achieve. And one of the key things in the upper right-hand portion of the circle there is the evolving roles of buildings and operations. And where we have traditionally thought of buildings as being comfortable, we always want our buildings to be comfortable and usable, but more importantly, it was a place of commerce. People looked at things in a certain way, but now we're seeing that the role of buildings are evolving dramatically. And where we would be talking about healthy buildings, well buildings, buildings that were, platinum certified, and that was generally for environmental considerations and then some health considerations as well. Now all of a sudden we're looking at this and people are expecting your buildings to be a place of haven. And they're not willing to go back in and think that their risk is going to be greater by going into those buildings versus being able to work in some of the other settings that they are currently working in and spending their time in. So for us, it's critically important that we start to think about ways in which we can help meet those expectations and be able to communicate those effectively. And so as we talk about the different plans, and this is really where the question came out for the group discussion, which is to start thinking about how do you integrate your building operations, your building management plans into the other programs that your risk management team has, your legal team may have, your HR group is going to have to deal with, because being able to have a well-coordinated program is going to be really a key to having a solution to this problem. Because unfortunately, we know that there are going to be additional illnesses that will occur. People become infected, people will be leaving the workplace. And the big thing here is for us to be able to have a program in place that allows us to not force a reclosure of the building. Being able to ensure that the appropriate steps have been taken, that you have programs in place to deal with where people may be ill, and that you can continue to maintain that safe haven reputation that you really want to have as people come back into your buildings. So along those lines is a couple of different management plans that we'll talk about right now. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this when we get into the question and answer portion of the program. But the key elements of the management plans that we're seeing right now are listed on the left-hand side over there, which is really HVAC operations and decisions around that, indoor air quality programs that you're going to have in place and how you can interpret things, water quality. You're going back into buildings that have been vacant for the most part for a long period of time, and you're not going to have high water use within a lot of those buildings, which can be problematic for us. You know, what are the cleaning procedures and programs that you really need to have in place? And then finally, you know, what are the HR policies for talent management that you have to have prepared to go? And just for the sake of time, I'm only going to go through the first three right now, but we can certainly talk about some of the others at a later point if you'd like. Some of the things we're looking at, and I just want to give you a little bit of information that we've seen from programs that we've done around the country in helping people get back into their buildings right now. We start talking about outdoor air and filtration. And one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of buildings need to increase the amount of outside air that they have, so that they're currently bringing in. So one of the big things is going back and really understanding the overall design intent of your HVAC system, so you know what an adequate amount of outside air is, what you're going to be able to achieve, how can you optimize it and maximize that. And the other thing we're going to be seeing is that a lot of buildings and operations are looking to de-densify their spaces. And so what does that mean? Well, they're going to have a lower occupancy perhaps within the building. They're going to perhaps use different shifts. They're certainly going to have people coming in at different times within the workday. And our workdays may be expanding from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., something along those lines, maybe even later. And so, you know, so now we have a building that you're looking to bring in maximum amounts of outside air that's going to have a relatively low density. So temperature control is going to be critically important. That means you're going to be utilizing reheat operations on a more regular basis right now and trying to manage that. You know, the other thing is that people are talking about increasing filtration, putting high efficiency filters, not, you know, not the HEPA filters, but higher efficiency filters in the outside air intakes. And what we're really seeing is that can have a tremendous impact on overall performance of the system. It can have an impact requiring change out of, you know, shivs on different systems and mechanical systems and the like. And we're not seeing that really presents a huge management gain for that. And so having the maximum filtration efficiency that you can tolerate is always a good thing, having it well fitted, having it well managed. But the fact of the matter is going to a high filtration is probably not going to gain a whole lot with respect to control of COVID-19. The same is true for humidification, where we're seeing people getting recommendations to increase humidification levels inside their building. And there's a challenge that goes along with that. And I'm sure all of you realize the fact that just increasing humidity is not a simple matter. Because you also have to be thinking about what impact is this going to have on your building envelope, and can your building handle higher humidity? So these are things to be thinking about now as you start to put your plans together, because what sounds like a simple request or a simple decision to be made can have long-term ramifications of your building as a whole. The same is true as we get into then operational control, because now you're looking to disable certain setbacks that you may have. You're going to be also extending the time frame in which you're going to be operating your systems. So these are all important things to be taking into account. And that includes the startup. And it's really not going to be a matter of flushing your system out, but it really is going to be putting it through its paces so that, all of your reheat coils are not going to then be emitting material into the space when you start them up for the first time and people are coming back in. Again, we're trying to manage people going back into the spaces so they're not getting overly concerned about some unknown event that's happening within the space. And the other question we get is, should we be cleaning our ductwork before people re-enter the building? And if you have to clean your ductwork because it's on a schedule to be cleaned, then I think certainly you want to take that into account. But doing it specifically to try to stop COVID-19 is not something that we're seeing is a real benefit. The one thing you find with viruses is the fact is it's very different than mold. And people think about mold and viruses as almost interchangeable. They're not. Mold is viable. It continues to grow. It'll continue to expand under the right environmental conditions. Viruses will deposit, but viruses will also desiccate. They don't grow. They don't reproduce. The only way they can reproduce is if they are actually taken into a host, which are humans. And so, it'll desiccate within the ductwork itself, and that we really don't see that as being a major benefit that people need to spend time on right now. There's also a host of different tools or different technologies that people are recommending, ultraviolet light and the like, and they can work in certain applications, but not in all. And really understanding, where they will work and whether or not changes that are being made to your system right now are going to help support that or not is something that's important to understand before you go in and make a significant capital investment. That's also going to have an impact on long-term operational costs as well. And one other thing to think about as we go into our HVAC operations is also doing a job hazard analysis, because you may be asking some of your workers and tradesmen, whether they be on staff or with vendors that are coming in, to go into certain areas that may present a risk to them. And so you really just want to take that into account, understand what that potential risk is, and be able to alert them to that fact. So it's just a little bit different right now. So thinking about the potential for infectivity of deposited material is going to be important as far as setting up operational plans. Okay. So, there's a lot more we could talk about with respect to equipment and the like, but I just want to give you a couple of ideas as to some of the things that you want to be considering as you're putting your plans together. We think about indoor air quality. And, and I know that a lot of you have spent a lot of effort in trying to enhance indoor air quality throughout your buildings. And what you're going to be seeing right now is a lot of the benchmarks that you've been trying to utilize as far as making decisions with respect to air quality may be changing. And so being aware of that and being able to take those into account as you start to think about those key building indicators that you may be tracking is going to be important. And there's some different ways we can look at it. And some of the metrics that people think about will be CO2, for example, as an indicator of outside air supply and as a surrogate for that. And if you're looking at 25% occupant density, you're not going to have the same sources of within your space. So you're not going to be able to utilize them as effectively as you could in trying to determine whether or not you have the adequate amount of outdoor air being delivered to your space. The same is true for airborne particles. And you're going to be seeing probably what's going to be more important will be very localized areas as opposed to more general environmental concerns. And what you may have to do, because if you have a lower density, you may actually have to reduce airflow in certain areas because people will start complaining about drafts being cold. So you may be making localized adjustments. If you're doing that, you're not going to get the dilution that you expect within those spaces. And so therefore, what you may have to be thinking about is putting in some localized filtration for the time being, which may be standalone units that you'll be putting in there, because that has to then tie in with what you're trying to achieve for your overall air exchange rate. Then finally, as you start looking at different elements, a lot of you are measuring total volatile organic compounds, and you'll typically see right now that they're rising significantly. And it's primarily because of this little guy right here. And where we're looking at people utilizing the hand sanitizers, people cleaning down their areas. So you'll typically see the total volatile organics rising significantly in the spaces right now. That does not necessarily mean that there's a hazard. But the other thing we're finding is that with a lot of the cleaning that's going on, a lot of very harsh chemicals are being used, and that is actually releasing some irritants into the space. And so just be prepared in that these concerns could be showing up, and what you want to be able to do is to be thinking about this, anticipating them, so that you're able to address them effectively as you bring people back into your buildings. And then we have our water systems, water quality issues, and certainly potable water is critically important for us. And one of the things that we'll often see is that because of the lack of use, you essentially have created sometimes 25-story dead lakes in your buildings at this point right now. And so you're going to get biofilm that'll be forming. And so you may need to start doing some very specific testing to identify where those dead lakes exist and where you may have some of your pipes that may have a biofilm on the interior, so that you can actually do some treatment of those specific areas and get that resolved. The other issue that, and sometimes that'll tie up, that may be as simple as dealing with the aerators that you have and looking at the terminal ends of your supply system, distribution system, or it may mean that you have to be looking at throughout your entire system to help resolve that. And you're not going to have the same water exchange going on in your buildings if you're looking at some places are starting out with 10% reoccupancy or 20% reoccupancy. So it's going to take a while. So we're not going to be flushing it through effectively for a long period of time. And so addressing that through better management and better assessment is going to be important. The other thing is to think about as you go through your processed water, whether it be cooling towers or fountains or other decorative features you may have. We're focusing right now on coronavirus, but one of the things that is so important to be able to deal with and to think about is really the issues surrounding Legionella. That's been a problem that has been with us, for 40 years, and it's been with us for much longer than that, but it's been recognized for 40 years as to what the causes are. And we still have not gotten it under effective control for many, many buildings. So this is an opportunity to start to integrate your programs overall and really have something that provides a healthful environment for people as they go back in and re-enter their buildings. And that ties into your water treatment companies understanding what they're actually measuring, being sure that that is giving you a solid indication of what's going on within your building systems so that you can make educated decisions going forward. So I'm not going to spend time in cleaning right now or trying to link this up with the HR policies, but those are important elements going forward. And so in conclusion, really looking at this and thinking about, we have to be able to build confidence and trust in the people that are coming back into the buildings. And they're going to be, looking to you and your team to provide them information and let them know that, in fact, the building is safe. And one of the big things that we find is when people say, well, can we ever say anything is safe? Well, we make decisions. And as long as you are confident that you are meeting today's standard of care, and that you have a program in place that is based on a solid plan that's being effectively implemented, and you're monitoring it to be able to provide solid data in going forward, then you're doing your part to provide a safe environment for people to go in there, and you can say that with confidence. The important thing as people start to reoccupy and we start to ramp up people within our buildings and hopefully getting back to 100% occupancy sometime in the, I won't say near future, but sometime in the future, that you're able to sustain that confidence and trust that you've built up during that reoccupancy period. And it's going to be important that you have good communications that get out to people, that are talking about the effectiveness of the building and how protective and safe the building can be. And I think that really becomes a new element of many people's missions as they go forward. And then being able to monitor what this means in going forward. And that's having actionable data. So it's not just looking at a building automation system and saying everything's working well. It really is understanding where the limitations may exist in some of that data and maybe targeting something else. It's also being able to communicate between teams. And I think one of the good things that has come out of the coronavirus issues right now that we're dealing with right now has been enhanced communication between teams that may not have spoken as much as they have in the past. And then the other thing is that things will change. There's going to be the ability to move, cut back on the outside air. You're really thinking of recirculation strategies and the like. But the other thing that's going to happen is there will be additional infections going forward. And what we need to be able to do right now is have a program that allows us to adapt, be creative, but really be able to make the modifications that are necessary so that we don't things don't result in us shutting down our buildings again. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Janessa, and take any questions that we may have or get into the discussion.
Excellent. I don't have a building, and this was all very, very, well, I have a house, but all very interesting to me. So this is great. Jack, can I ask you to unshare your screen? That way, if people want to go back to gallery view and see everyone asking questions, that's great. So I'm going to start with one of the chat questions, and then feel free, those who already put something in the chat or want to ask as well. So this one is from Andrew Delpreet of Liberty Mutual. Do you anticipate LEED certified buildings to drop from a platinum to gold with changes that may be required with air changes and longer run times?
That's a really good question. And I think that in talking with people right now at LEED, there's been no decision on that. I think that people are realistic that to achieve the long-term goals that they want to have for their program, that they're going to sacrifice some segments as far as energy efficiency goes. So that is going to have some impact. And I think it's going to be really initially some negotiation that's going to take place, but starting that conversation will be important if you have a building coming online, for example, that you're trying to achieve LEED certification with. It is for all of those, all of the certification programs, they're going to have to rethink where things stand right now and be willing to be flexible in moving forward. And I really think that there's a realization that that's necessary. So I think that you will see some changes in the short term, at least. But ultimately, the long-term goals would be what's will be maintained, and you'll have to still achieve the energy conservation goals that you've set forward in your original application.
Excellent. Another question was, I know that we've talked about this whole idea of a phased startup and how, different shifts and so forth, which you touched on. Is there a benchmark for a square footage per person that we should be keeping for a return to work?
Well, it's interesting in that, if you think about, your personal environment, you're trying to maintain your 6 foot distancing between people. And I don't know if any of you have seen those bumper tables, the big inner tubes they had where some restaurants, or a restaurant down in Maryland has these 6 foot tables, or 3 foot radius tables that are there. So you're always going to be 6 feet apart from other people. And people come with all sorts of different ways of doing it. But if you take and you're saying that, you want to have a 6 foot radius around individuals, and you say, well, what does that really represent as we're going forward? That means you could probably put in 6 to 7 people per 1,000 square feet. And that's not dramatically different from what ASHRAE had been recommending in the past. And so from a pure square footage area, you have adequate distancing. Now, the other thing you have is a lot of that is also tied up in aisleways and spaces that may, your different conference rooms and collaboration areas and things like that. So that's not going to count as well. So, but you also can, the original 6 foot distancing was intended to stay away from people who were sneezing and coughing, who were actively ill and not wearing face masks. So, what we're really doing is we're layering certain controls on things right now to try to enhance where we're going and where I should, the overall plans. And so I think along those lines, you're going to find that the 6 feet will not necessarily be quite as rigid. You're going to have more flexibility. I mean, one of the things that we're doing in our office is that we're relocating some of the desks that we have to some of the common areas for the time being. And I think that as we start to have people come back in, people start feeling more comfortable, we'll be able to go back to the, to closer to where we are. But I think you are going to be looking at, your maximum is going to be about 7 per 1,000 square feet. The challenge for people right now is going to be call centers where you have the spacing, so you have to be a little more creative. Then you're also going to be thinking about, can you use some other barriers between spaces so that if you can't get your distancing, can you increase the height? Because what you're trying to do is to minimize the actual transfer. Going back to the aerobiological pathway, the dispersion of material, how can you control that? And so you kind of go back to, in one sense, cubicles, raising the height around you to minimize the actual direct air transfer. Because particles, unless they're small enough, are not going to stay airborne for a long period of time. They're going to settle out. And what you want to do is be certainly taking care of your own space that you're working at, but also you have cleaning companies coming in and things along those lines. So we're trying to minimize the transfer that can occur to our neighbors, to the rest of the community that we're with. So.
Awesome. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to be cognizant of everyone's time that you're probably wanting to get onto your weekend. One other, how does the RH of the air in the space influence the spread of virus particles? Okay. I don't even know what that means.
Okay, well, let me, what you're looking at here is, and there's a lot of discussion about the impact of relative humidity on viral particles. And it interacts with, first of all, the respiratory tract, because if it's too dry, your respiratory tract will become somewhat desiccated itself, and you will then, there is some discussion, it's not been proven yet, that will enhance your susceptibility to infection, because now you have a particle, it's now able to bypass the mucus membrane, bypass the mucus coatings that you have, and actually start to come in direct contact with skin, with your membranes. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that when there's some discussion that if you increase the relative humidity, say going from 50% up to 80% within a building, that you'll find your viral droplets will in fact start to die off. And it's that's a not really well characterized at this time. It's based on a very limited study under very controlled conditions. And so I wouldn't try to utilize humidity control as being a solution, because actually it was 60% to 90%, because trying to maintain 90% humidity in one of our buildings right now is virtually impossible and can have other serious impacts on the envelope of the building. So, I think the really, it still comes down to the key things as far as controlling your controlling exposures. Not necessarily going to be humidity based. It's going to be on dilution with outside air, clean air, or filtered recirculated air, or it's going to be from breaking that aerobiological pathway so people can't get exposed to this. And then finally having effective cleaning of surfaces that will minimize secondary transfer and infection from that point.
Awesome. All right, guys. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much, Jack, for sharing all of. I think we literally could go all day, and we would still not have all of our answers. So this is great.
Super helpful. Thank you, Jack. Great information.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much.
See you.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Excellent.
Bye.
All right. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too.